And so after 8 years of trying to come up with something under that rule, that parameter, of course they can come up with a theory. Really, any theory that they come up with becomes the best theory available, because they're just rejecting creationism from the get-go. So whatever they come up with, that becomes the best working theory.
And 8 years later, research and data have contributed to a new theoretical model for how those microenvironments can contribute to the preservation of soft tissue after such long periods of time.
Did you catch that? After such long periods of time. It's already assumed that these things are lasting millions of years, and they're just figuring out how. They're never questioning whether or not they could actually be young. That's never on the table.
It has to do with the role of iron and oxygen chemistry.
A theory. See, they have to come up with something as long as it's not young Earth creationism. If, for example, you reject any possibility for young Earth creationism in the cosmology of the universe, it's inevitable that you're going to come up with a theory like the Big Bang. Because you get enough smart people in the room and tell them this option is not available, they will figure out some other option, even if it's implausible, because it's the only options available to them.
Including the presence of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones.
We already know why there is carbon-14 in dinosaur bones, and it does not complicate in any way, shape, or form whatsoever the well-established fact that they are tens and even hundreds of millions of years old.
If you look at the last sentence on the screen, it literally betrays their anti-creationist bias. They say that they're preparing this information for educators to basically ward off the claims of creationists. They've already made the decision in advance. But when you look at their actual explanation, it doesn't hold water at all. You see, that explanation that Dan just provided basically just says that if you have any carbon-14 in your sample that you're testing for a fossil from a dinosaur bone, it must be cross-contamination. Why? Because carbon-14 is only found in living organisms. You see, carbon-14 is generated when the solar winds come into contact with the nitrogen in the atmosphere. It creates carbon-14, which then gets absorbed by plants because plants breathe carbon dioxide, and then those plants get eaten by living things. They become part of the food chain. So now living organisms have carbon-14 in them, and when they die, the decay rate of that carbon-14 can be tested. Rocks don't eat things, so they don't consume carbon-14, so therefore you can't test carbon-14 in rocks. Well, what happens during fossilization? Basically, the fossil, the dinosaur bone, the living tissue, becomes mineralized. It turns into a rock. Now, how do you test rocks? Well, you do that through radiometric dating, not carbon-14. But here's the problem. They're basically saying that you can't test dinosaur fossils for carbon-14 because dinosaur fossils don't have carbon-14. They're mineralized. You basically be testing the rocks, and rocks don't eat things. The rock is what's left over from taking the place of where the dinosaur bone once was. It's a process of fossilization, mineralization. So, here's the problem. They won't even test for carbon-14 because they just assume that if you find carbon-14 in the fossil, it must be cross-contamination because rocks, again, don't eat things. Now, how does that compare with the original story of Mary Schweitzer finding soft tissue in dinosaurs? She's talking about actual soft tissue from actual dinosaurs that actually ate things. Therefore, we know that this soft tissue is not mineralization. It's not a rock, and it could be tested for carbon-14. But Dan is trying to claim that they already know how carbon-14 gets into these samples, that it has to be cross-contamination because all fossils are rocks. But this whole article is about the fact that not all fossils are rocks, that we found soft dinosaur tissue. So what Dan is presenting here is actually quite a smokescreen.
Once again, consistent with an age of only a few thousand years.
Not really consistent. There are some results that would fit within a young Earth timeline, but the majority of the results are into the several thousands of years old and even tens of thousands of years old. So even if those C14 results were considered accurate and reliable, it would not fit a young Earth creationist timeline.
Carbon-14 is widely considered to be the best dating method that science has, but it doesn't mean it's the best. It just means it's the best they have. You see, carbon-14 oftentimes has a lot of errors and problems. Many times you can date a sample and get different results, even though you're dating the same sample multiple times. So, the fact that you have a widespread range of thousands of years in carbon-14 dating is more emblematic of the problem with carbon-14 dating. But one thing it does prove for sure is that these things are thousands of years old, not millions, tens of millions, or even hundreds of millions of years old. That's the point. That their whole system is built around a doctrine, a dogma, and not real empirical science. Now, the next part that Dan is going to go over, I would invite you to just do this. Anytime he says apologist, just replace it with the word evolutionist, because everything he's about to say actually applies to evolutionary scientists and the dogma that they push.
So the difference between a scientific approach to these data and an apologetic approach to these data is a scientist is going to allow the data to operate on their own terms, and they're going to follow the data where they lead. An apologist already knows where they need to arrive at, and the data becomes an obstacle that needs to be overcome. And they have to try to make a case that the data are not an obstacle, but they're making that case to people who already agree and who want to believe. And so they don't actually have to make a compelling case, they just have to show that it's not impossible. And as long as they can gin up the tiniest little sliver of not impossible for those people who already agree to hold on to, they can feel validated in their agreement. And that is the entire goal of apologetics. It's not to convince people who actually allow the data to operate on their own terms and follow the data where they lead. It's to make people who already want to believe feel validated in that belief.
Don't listen to somebody just because they say they're an expert, even if they're well-credentialed. And certainly don't listen to some sock on TikTok. Seek out the truth for yourself. And if anybody is trying to confuse you or get you to a point where you have to depend upon them to tell you what's real or not, that is a false teacher. Walk away, because a real teacher will point you towards the truth and point you towards your Creator.